What is Keir Starmer playing at here? We talked a couple of nights ago about what his Labour Party actually stands for, and tonight it seems even less clear. If you're one of those almost mythical centre ground voters who the Labour leader is trying to appeal to, does this make his party look like a grown-up government in waiting to you? 0345 6060 973. Let's talk about this with the journalist Sienna Rodgers. Sienna is a senior writer for The House magazine and was previously the editor of the website Labour List, which supports the Labour Party but is independent of it. Hello, Sienna.
Good evening.
So, what are your thoughts about what happened today?
Well, more broadly, it's unfortunate because the Conservatives are tearing themselves apart. They've got this leadership battle that should be really good for Labour. It's providing clips for Labour. But unfortunately for the Labour Party, it's once again turned into a story about Labour chaos and disagreement and factionalism and all the rest of it. So, I think certainly allies of Keir Starmer would say that Sam Tarry had to be sacked because it's not just that he joined a picket line in support of these striking railway workers, but it's that he actually arranged a sort of media round this morning for himself, and he was commenting on party policy, all without approval. And as a front bencher, he's not allowed to do that. But I think the kind of, Sam Tarry allies and others in the party will probably just point out that, it's problematic because there probably are many other Labour MPs, including ones on the front bench, who in future will have picket lines in their constituencies and will be tempted very much to do the same thing and to defy orders, join those picket lines and maybe make comments that aren't in line with Labour policy about pay and how it should rise with inflation, because that's what a lot of Labour MPs believe. But also it speaks to the kind of very poor relations that the Labour Party and the leadership in particular has at the moment with trade unions, including unions that are affiliated to the party. And there have been some very bold comments today after Sam Tarry's sacking.
It's almost as though Sam Tarry was trying to get sacked, isn't it?
Possibly. I think he was quite clever about it in that he did arrange this sort of kind of series of media interviews about it, but throughout he has tried to not criticise Keir Starmer at all, say that he's going to be fighting for him to be in number 10, that they had a very constructive conversation. I think towards the end of the day, that kind of position wore down a bit, and he started talking about how Starmer has a far worse relationship with trade unions than even Tony Blair did. But I think there is an element of, certainly people who are quite cynical about what happened today would say that, well, Sam Tarry is up for potential deselection because people in his constituency have voted for there to be a full selection process. So he could be losing his seat, and maybe he doesn't have that much to lose right now. He didn't go on picket lines last time this happened in June when they were warned against it. So, yes, perhaps he was expecting to be sacked. But again, it kind of speaks to Keir Starmer's relationship with Unite the Union, Labour's biggest funder, with a union like TSSA, whose General Secretary said today that they're ashamed of the Labour Party leadership. And if Keir Starmer doesn't understand the basic concept of solidarity, then he's not worthy of leading our party. That's what the General Secretary said today. And that's a union that actually nominated Keir Starmer for the Labour leadership 2 years ago.
This is just so typically left. They will be presented with an open goal, and not only will they miss the goal, they'll miss the ball. As the Tory party are fighting each other to the ground, the Labour Party take the spotlight off that and put it onto their own problems. Why can't they just get in a line and acquire power by not frightening people away like this?
I think, the Labour Party is a broad church. There's always going to be factional battles, but it's about how those battles are conducted, and there are some seriously spicy comments being doled out on both sides of this argument today. You've got Labour sources calling Sam Tarry an absolute nobody who has never achieved anything, who doesn't deserve this amount of attention. Well, this is the man who was on the front bench a couple of minutes ago.
No one has heard of him. I mean, of course people have heard of him, but if I had £100 in my hand and asked 1,000 people in the street who is Sam Tarry, they wouldn't have a clue.
Well, of course, but you could say that about most politicians, couldn't you?
Well, maybe, yeah.
But it's all so toxic, as ever, with the Labour Party. I mean, they only, was it last week, had this Ford report out all about toxic factionalism. And Keir Starmer has said it's his mission to reduce that kind of toxicity. But when things like this happen, these rows blow up and it distracts from any kind of difficulties the Tories may be having. It seems as if not enough has changed.
Yeah, the Tory party are also riven with differences. There's wings in the Tory party that can't stand the sight of other parts of the Conservative Party. But the one thing they're good at is acquiring and then holding on to power. Labour are abysmal at it. I mean, just awful. They haven't learned any lessons at all. And this Sam Tarry fella, he ain't helping, is he?
Well, I mean, I think Sam Tarry would make the argument that he's staying true to what he believes being a Labour MP is. I mean, he comes from a trade union background, so he was always going to take this kind of position. I think... But
do you not think it doesn't really matter what he thinks his job is? His job is what his boss tells him his job is.
Well, of course, Keir Starmer is fully entitled to choose who's on his front bench. That is completely... in the power of the Labour leader. That's completely understandable. But I think people just have questions over how Labour Party is going to keep its funding, is going to keep its historical ties with unions when it's taking the kind of positions it is taking at the moment.
Yeah, it's a difficult act that Keir Starmer has got to engage in, really, because, as you say, they get the majority of their funds, or a great chunk of it, from the unions, which represent working class people, and yet working class people don't vote Labour much anymore. It's the Conservative Party that the working class voted for last time around.
Well, clearly this is something that Keir Starmer is wanting to reverse. His real focus has been on these red wall seats, and people around the leader will say that that's not his number one priority. He wants to win all over the country, but clearly they are directing resources to those seats in particular, and that is his main mission. And people will judge his success at the next election by the extent to which he holds on to the red wall seats that he does have, and gains back some of those seats that were lost in 2019. That is absolutely crucial. So this is what this big battle, that's the context of these kind of factional battles. But, I mean, just today should not have been a day about Labour chaos and infighting, and it was.
Do you think that what Keir Starmer is actually trying to do is fight the Tories' claim that when they keep trotting this out, and as more strikes come about, they will amplify this message, that these strikes are Labour's strikes? Now, the truth of it is neither here nor there. It's one of their phrases. It's happily a three-word phrase. Labour, it's two words actually. Labour's strikes, and they'll just keep saying it over and over again, and they'll get lodged in people's minds. And the more that that various Labour ministers viewed to support these strikes, the more it will get lodged in the public's mind that this is less about the unions and more about the Labour Party.
I think by taking this kind of action, that's precisely what Keir Starmer is trying to avoid. He wants to make sure that if the next Prime Minister, if those Tory candidates during this leadership contest start talking about Labour's strikes, that actually he can come back and say, well, I took very firm action against Sam Tarry, for example. I've been very firm on this with all my front benchers, and so that he can reject exactly that claim. I think the problem is, though, that, there's a risk, as you say, that with all these news stories, people will still start to kind of associate Labour with not just a particular position. I don't think that's so much the problem. It's more associating Labour with confusion, with indecision, with mixed messages. And, people are very cynical about politics and politicians, aren't they? So they'll probably hear the opposite of what they'd like to hear from politicians.
Well, yeah, they may have a mixed message, but the Tory party do not have a mixed message about the Labour Party. And that's what people will hear. Without a clear position, another 3-word or 2-word slogan from the Labour Party, what people will start to associate them with is what the Tories are saying they are.
Yeah, that is always the danger. And the Tories have consistently been, for some years now, especially at the last election, but even before that with long-term economic plan, they always manage to have these slogans that they stick with and repeat over and over again. And all of us journalists and people in the Westminster bubble, we're absolutely sick of it as soon as they latch on to one of these slogans. But people need that because they don't pay attention to every twist and turn in politics every day, whereas Labour Party is just not as good as that kind of consistent messaging. It really struggles, and we've seen, I think maybe a dozen slogans since Keir Starmer took over as Labour leader, and they're clearly trying to test out their messaging, seeing what works and what doesn't, but there is going to be a general election fairly soon, and they need to start sticking with a narrative, choosing one, and repeating it over and over so that people like us are sick of hearing it.
What I hear from people calling the station here is that, they're all the same. Labour, Tory, you can't really make a difference between them. Are the unions really that daft that they're going to now pick a fight with the Labour Party, who's, and if the Labour Party was to win the next election, they would have a much better time, it would be a better outcome for them if the Labour Party won, which is something that they can ruin the prospect of if they pick this fight now.
Well, I think, we've had over the last couple of years lots of elections for the general secretaries of trade unions that are affiliated to the Labour Party, and a theme in those elections are the new leaders are very keen on getting value for money for their members, and that's kind of how they're phrasing it. Especially the new General Secretary of Unite, but also GMB. And they're really less interested in Labour factionalism, but more interested in making sure the Labour Party supports them in disputes, including the ones that we're going to see this summer. It's not going to be limited to rail workers.
But isn't it more likely, even if the Labour Party doesn't say, yes, we are 100% behind you, isn't it more likely that they will support them as compared to a Conservative government? They just have to pick one, surely. Yeah,
it definitely is more likely. And I think that I think there is a lot of talk about disaffiliation. This is something that comes up at all their conferences. It's come up several times this year. And each time, actually by a pretty good margin, they have voted to stay affiliated, that is, formally linked to the Labour Party. So clearly the appetite is very strong for a Labour government, and they recognise everything you just said, that they'd be better off with the Labour Party in power from their perspective. So I think in the end, the Labour leadership probably knows this, that unions do not want to disaffiliate. They know that the general election is on the horizon, and actually it's looking for the first time in a long time that Labour has a chance of winning that election. So right. I think they are aware of that.
Yeah, unless the usual happens and they snatch failure from the jaws of success. Good to talk to you, Sienna. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Sienna Rodgers, senior writer for The House magazine and former editor of Labour List. So how does the Labour Party benefit from Starmer sacking a shadow minister who joined a picket line? Is it actually the shadow minister's fault and not Keir Starmer's fault? He had very specific instructions. Don't join a picket line. And then he went and joined a picket line. It's not doing the Labour Party any good, and by extension, if it makes it more likely that we get another Conservative government at the next general election, it's not going to do the unions any good. But it's what the left specialise in, shooting themselves in the foot.